Welcome to the Productpreneur Podcast. I'm your host, Nicole Delarzak, product development and marketing coach and mom of three. Learn from and get inspired by women entrepreneurs killing it in the product space. Each episode, we will share the latest trends, proven strategies, and inside secrets of the product world, all designed to give you greater confidence to create your own success through a product venture. Let's do this. Welcome to another episode of the Productpreneur Podcast. Last week, we had the co-founders of Skokie Conscious Kids Apparel on the show. Along with a theme of sustainable fashion, today we have an expert on this topic, as she's not only founded and sold a sustainable clothing company, she also teaches this to other women. First, I wanted to share a listener review. A must-listen from the part-time jungle. If you are a productpreneur or entrepreneur in general, you should definitely check out this podcast. Nicole has an easygoing, relatable, and highly informative approach that highlights her expertise and experience with product-based businesses. She engages in meaningful conversations with guests that will leave you with practical, tangible, and doable strategies as well as food for thought. Definitely check out episode 22 with Kirsten Jordan of Perfectly Imperfect Social. Can't wait for the next episode. Thank you so much, Part-Time Jungle. I'm so grateful for this review. Now, if you are listening to this and you could take a minute to leave a 5-star review on iTunes, you will make me so happy and also help others find the show. Also, if you're listening to these episodes and you've got an idea burning in your mind, or if you're just struggling with scaling your business, or maybe you want to talk to someone other than your spouse about your business, for a limited time, I'm opening up spots for a free 1-hour strategy call to help you out. You can go to NicoleDelarzak.com and book it there, or click on the link in the show notes. Now on with the show. Shannon Lohr is the founder of Factory 45, an online accelerator program that takes sustainable fashion brands from idea to launch. Over the past 7 years, she's worked with entrepreneurs all over the globe to source fabric, set up manufacturing, and raise money to launch their brands. Shannon is also the co-founder of Revolution Apparel, a sustainable clothing company for female travelers and minimalists that was featured in the New York Times and Forbes.com. Shannon is passionate about empowering women who want to create something that betters the world. In this episode, you'll learn about why sustainable fashion is important to consumers, how consumers can take steps to being more sustainable in their choices, steps to growing a sustainable fashion brand, what you must do before launching, pre-selling and crowdfunding so you can fund your launch, and so much more. Shannon is a wealth of information, and I know you're going to learn so much. Enjoy the show. Shannon, welcome to the show. Thanks for coming.
Thank you so much for having me.
I am so excited to dive right into this because this is not something that we've spoken a lot about in the podcast, which is sustainable fashion. And so I'd love for you to tell us a little bit more about your journey to developing your own sustainable fashion brand and then starting a service called Factory 45.
Yeah, so I got started in the fashion industry in 2010. So I was just kind of wanting to start my own business. I didn't really have more direction than that. But long story short, my then co-founder and I got together and we decided that we were going to launch a fashion brand. We did not have a fashion background. We didn't know really what we were doing at all. And we sort of learned as we went. We really didn't have any idea how to start a fashion brand, but we knew that as we were researching what it would take, we started to learn about fashion's impact on the environment, on the people who make our clothes. And we decided if we were going to start something, we wanted to do it in a way that helped people and planet. We didn't want to add to the big fast fashion problem. So we ended up launching the highest funded fashion project in Kickstarter history at the time. We quadrupled our first production run. We were featured in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal. Like it was this big whirlwind, this amazing experience. And we ended up going into production, had all of these customers and kept pre-selling. It was just this amazing, amazing first experience in entrepreneurship. But again, long story short, I sold my portion of the business to my business partner in 2012. We just sort of looked at it as like, this was a great first project, but we want to go do different things. And we wanted to keep our friendship because we were friends first. And if anyone has started a business with a co-founder before, they know that business can be very hard on a friendship and partnership. So that I spent about a year in 2013 sort of trying to figure out what I wanted to do next. And what I knew was that it should be easier for people to start clothing companies in a way that is sustainably made, ethically made, made in America. That was sort of my emphasis because we were doing everything made in the USA. All our supply chain was within a 50-mile radius of North Carolina. Like that was sort of unheard of at the time to have such a localized supply chain. That brought me to starting Factory 45, which is my current business.
Oh, amazing. Yes, I agree that it should be more accessible to people because actually most people who come on the podcast say, I really wanted to produce locally, but I can't find the manufacturer
Mhm.
or producer, whatever. And so they are forced almost to go overseas for basically cost reasons.
Mhm.
So it's great that you've started this and you're helping people do the same thing that you did. Tell us a little bit more about what Factory 45 is.
Yeah. So in 2014, I launched the first Factory 45 program. It's an online accelerator program. It's 6 months long. And we really go from idea stage, like you may just have an idea in your head, nothing on paper, all the way to launching through pre-selling or crowdfunding. And so we go through sourcing, branding, building an audience, product development, manufacturing, e-commerce marketing, wholesale, and then, like I said, raising money for your first production run so that you're not risking your own savings and you know that you're launching with customers already supporting and buying what you have.
Very cool. Yeah, that's amazing. I think that's key for like to help people go from that idea stage because many people, and in my business too, many people are stuck on that idea and they don't know how to bring it to fruition to actually launching it. So you take them through every step of the way. And I know that you provide a lot of resources for them as well. So that's amazing. And you also have mentors who help them in your program.
Yeah. So it's funny because in 2014, there were not a lot of online courses. Like it was just the beginning stages of all. And now we have there is an online course for
Mm,
anything, which is
yes.
amazing, but it's much more saturated. And so from the beginning, I was very conscious of making sure that it wasn't just a self study online course. I have those smaller courses to offer, but for Factory 45, I knew there needed to be that personal hand holding and support because it is just so hard to bring a physical product to life. And so I have office hours every day to support all of the people in my program. And then I also bring in alumni mentors. So there are 9 alumni mentors who do virtual co-working sessions twice a month and are also available for text messaging support. And then we, of course, have a Facebook group where the whole community can come together and discuss and ask questions.
Oh, very cool. I love that idea. That's so great. So they can hear from people who've done it before.
Yeah.
And that's the biggest thing, to know that you're not alone and that you have people to talk to. And so oftentimes we get stuck in our own heads. So it's just great to reach out and get that
Yeah.
sort of feedback. That's amazing. I actually wanted to also ask you about sustainable fashion and, sustainable fashion versus fast fashion. What does sustainable fashion mean to you? And how should consumers kind of shift their thinking in how they purchase?
It's interesting because the pandemic has really brought to light the issues within the traditional fashion industry.
Mhm. Okay.
Overnight we saw retail stores like H&M, Forever 21, all of these fast fashion brands, their stores were just shutting down, right? And inventory was sitting in these stores. Meanwhile, they have a bunch of new inventory being produced and manufactured and having to pull that out. So we've always known that the fast fashion industry is unsustainable. Even if we have the H&Ms of the world saying they have conscious collections and that they're going to produce with all organic cotton, that's still millions and millions of organic cotton garments sitting in a landfill eventually. So that doesn't make you sustainable. Fast fashion's business model is inherently unsustainable. So, what we've been doing since 2014 is this idea of small batch, made to order, pre selling, localized supply chains, which all are now, again, coming to light in this time of the pandemic because that's what the whole fashion industry is supposedly shifting towards or needing to shift towards in order to make it.
Wow. Okay. And so, how much of actual clothing ends up in landfills?
Oh gosh, I used to know all these stats by heart. I don't want to make something up,
No,
but
yeah.
it's like millions of pounds.
And that's of just excess inventory that these stores have, or is also like just stuff that we don't wear anymore and we just want to throw it?
Yeah, it's mainly stuff that we don't wear anymore, but there's definitely, there are news articles you could find if you Googled like H&M just throwing out unsold inventory, like
Oh,
literally ripping through the garment so they can't be resold like on secondhand markets and then being shipped off to landfills.
wow. So sad. I've always thought about there's got to be a better way to donate or do something with our clothing, because I know that even clothing that we donate to, say, Salvation Army or these local places actually ends up in landfill. That's what I've heard.
Yeah, or in the secondhand markets in like Eastern Africa or Central America. And that creates a whole other slew of issues with their economy and their handcrafters and artisans who make clothing there. So, yeah,
Wow.
it's very complicated. Our tendency to dump our trash in other countries is, yeah, problematic.
Brutal. Yeah. And so what can we do as consumers to shop more sustainably?
The first thing, the most sustainable thing you can do is to shop from your closet. Really, like I think we have this mentality or this retail therapy that we need something new to feel better,
Hmm.
especially in these times where we're, not going out to restaurants as much or like being able to live our lives normally. There's this retail therapy happening. So, shopping from your closet, shopping secondhand, if you can make use of clothing that's already being used and out there, that's a great way to have a more sustainable wardrobe. And then, of course, supporting the small indie fashion brands, like the sustainable and ethical fashion brands that I work with, who are paying a fair and living wage to their sewers and their workers, are using sustainable fabrics that will, biodegrade or can be recycled, and just being really mindful of the clothing that you are purchasing and that it's something that you want to support.
And is there some kind of seal of approval? Like, how do you know without doing tons of research on each brand that they're ethical and sustainable?
So the problem is you do have to do the research. Unless you see like a GOT certified label or like a fair trade label, you really need to go to the brand's website, look at their about page, look at their product info, look at their fabric specifications. Unfortunately, it is up to the consumer. If you're really, committed to shopping more sustainably, it's still up to
Mhm.
us to do the research. And that's actually, as I was telling you before we started recording, why I started my podcast, which is the Clean Living Podcast, to kind of help people learn how to educate themselves and what they should be looking for, whether it's clothing or beauty products or food or home products.
Oh, that's great. That's so needed. Yeah, I think there's just like an education that needs to happen first. And then people will start to shift their behaviors. I think people already are starting to shift their behaviors, but they'll start even like continue even more. And then probably the big brands are going to start to follow because they have to.
That's what we hope for, it's like putting pressure. The best way to put pressure on the big brands is by using your dollars.
For people who want to launch in this space, do you think the sustainable fashion industry is just at the beginning, or is it becoming crowded and you sort of have to find your own footing there? Like, what would you say?
I think that in any market, you have to find your place in it, right? And so that's another focus, like not only the sustainability piece of Factory 45, but is making sure that people are creating brands and products that solve a problem, and they're not just creating like another t-shirt company. And so I do think that if you have a unique selling point, you are solving a problem, you have a niche target customer, or target market, then you can find your place in the market. It's the fashion industry is always going to be saturated. The sustainable fashion industry, I don't know if we're at the beginning. It still sort of feels that way, but
Mhm.
it's definitely not as at the beginning as when I started out. But I think it's important that there are more sustainable fashion brands so we can continue educating the consumer together and having that collective voice of what sustainable fashion is and why it matters.
I think that's so true. I think in any business, you've got to have your sort of point of difference. I think that sustainable fashion is here to stay, and probably it's still at the growth stage, I would imagine, because if it wasn't at the growth stage, then you'd see every other fashion brand being sustainable. So
Exactly. And you'd see every consumer wearing sustainable fashion and talking about it. And can you,
yeah,
this is who made my clothes. My clothes were made here. And that's just not
that's not
happening quite yet.
That's right. That's right. So, what would you advise someone who wants to get started with their own idea for apparel or fashion?
I guess it goes kind of back to what I was just saying is, making sure that you have a problem that you're solving in some way. It doesn't have to be the most obvious problem, but it's something that you can communicate clearly to your ideal target customer. And then you need to identify who is your ideal target customer, who is your niche market. I think people are so afraid of wanting to appeal to everyone that they're afraid to niche down and really get specific about who their brand and product is serving. From my experience, the companies that I see take off and do really well are the ones who are either A, solving a very specific problem, or B, solving a very specific niche market, and C, ideally they're doing both.
Right. That's so true. And just focusing, because a lot of people try to do everything and don't actually end up doing anything or appealing to anyone. That's great. And so, if somebody is just starting with you, what would be the first thing that you would tell them to do outside of finding their specific niche?
Yeah. So like in Factory 45, one of the first things we do is just write a one-page business plan.
Mhm.
I have the sentiment that these 40-page business plans that like our dads wrote are a thing of the past. So I really just get your ideas on paper, establish a few key factors. And then the next thing when it comes to physical products, clothing, any sewn good, start sourcing fabric. So that really is the thing, finding your materials that takes the longest. And so the more swatches you can get in the door, the more you can look at and hold different fabrics, the better off you will be, because you can't create samples or patterns or really anything until you have some sort of fabric or material. And then in terms of like the marketing side, simultaneously, as you're sourcing fabric, trying to find those materials, you have to build an audience. And this is the thing that I cannot emphasize enough. I'm just a broken record with this, is when it comes to launching, you have to have an audience before you launch.
That's a great point. Yeah, because otherwise, who are you selling to? And you want to
Mhm.
build up, as you have in your program, you want to build up that demand or even pre orders before you start to launch.
Exactly. I
Yeah.
think there's this false narrative that like, oh, I'm just going to create the product. I'm going to create all the photography and then I'll just use Facebook ads and Instagram ads. And it doesn't work that way. There has to be some built-in audience so that you have that early momentum. And then that can take you into some of the other, more strategic and savvy marketing strategies.
Yeah. In terms of building their audience, what is the number one tip you would give there?
So my focus is on email marketing and really getting people to opt into your email list, to collect emails on your list so that you can get into their inbox at least once a week, ideally more than that, but creating and cultivating that relationship so that you're providing value, you're providing, I always say, like, you need to entertain them or provide something valuable or educate or whatever it is. The more you give, if you give to your list, they will become trusting of you, and that builds brand trust. And then if you've done that for 6 months and you're ready to launch and have an ask of them, to sell your product to them, then they're going to be so much more likely to support you and be excited about your brand because you've already invested in them.
I love that you're focusing on email marketing because, yeah, a lot of people focus on social media. And well, that's great. That can be used to build your list, your email list, and you own your
Exactly.
email list. Yeah. So it's so important.
Yes, that's what people, I think, sometimes they forget is you don't own your Instagram following. As we've seen, like here's, 13,000 followers and 70 people see it or whatever it
Exactly.
is. But with your email list, you own that list. And again, like it's not one or the other. You're still using social media. Social media is important, but it's important to drive people back to your email opt-in.
Exactly. So good. Yeah, and going back to the business plan, that's interesting. I agree. The one pager is great. Although sometimes you need like for funding, they want you to develop a long business plan if they're going to
Mhm.
like if you're going to a bank for a loan, for example. So do you kind of give your clients that option to, if they really want to build a longer business plan to do that?
They are absolutely welcome to. I am not an advocate for bank loans or VC funding, angel investing in the beginning, especially with fashion brands. It can be such a fickle industry where banks, for one, are not willing to invest unless you have some sort of like track record or other successful companies behind you. So again, like my launch strategy is on pre-selling and bootstrapping and not worrying about sort of the outside investment. First, making sure that you have a market need and you have customers who want what you're selling.
Oh, cool. Love that. Yeah, just developing the demand and having an audience to sell to. Perfect.
Yeah, and testing the market.
Yeah, it's like having a prototype and you're actually like getting feedback, but you're actually
Yes,
also earning something for it. So,
exactly.
yeah. And tell us about the process of developing a pattern and prototyping. Like most people would think, oh, I have to be a fashion designer or I have to be sort of in the sewing industry or whatever. But can you help us understand what this is like and how kind of, somebody who's just hasn't had any
Yeah.
experience in fashion can do this?
Yeah, that's such a good question because the majority of people who come through Factory 45 do not have a fashion background. Like
Mm,
they've never gone to fashion school. They don't know how to draft a pattern. Most of them are like scared that their sketching and like drawing skills are too poor. And I always tell everyone, like, your job is not to be the pattern maker, the sample maker, or even the designer. All of that can be outsourced. And let's leave it to the experts who know how to draft a pattern and create a sample. And actually, through Factory 45 in Module 3, I have a whole database of vetted pattern makers and sample makers and production partners who I refer to everyone to outsource that. But I think another part of Factory 45 is the education of manufacturing and product development. I'm not going to teach you how to draft a pattern, but I'll teach you how to understand apparel manufacturing because I think that is important. You don't want to go meet with a pattern maker or a factory just blind and not know anything about the industry because it's not their job to educate you. And that's why I emphasize so much to my entrepreneurs and just my audience in general is you have to be responsible for educating yourself. Like any entrepreneur, no matter what industry you're in, it's
right.
your responsibility to know the landscape.
That's a great point. And for people who want to find a manufacturer locally, how challenging is it? And can you help dispel the myth that you need these huge order quantities and whatnot, and that it's going to be way more expensive to organize locally?
Yeah, so most of the suppliers and manufacturers that I refer are all local to the United States, domestic. Factory 45 is a global program. So I have vendors all over the world, but the majority of the brands I work with are manufacturing domestically. And the great thing is, like, small batch is becoming so much more of a thing, even now on demand manufacturing. So
Mm,
manufacturing one at a time is now becoming more of a thing, which is, was basically unheard of 10 years ago when I was starting out. So in some ways it is more expensive. Like I can't completely dispel that myth, but it's all comparative. It's going to be more expensive than manufacturing in Bangladesh, but if you get your numbers up and your quantity orders up over time, your price per unit will go down.
yes, for sure. And then probably you can do the smaller batches than rather than going overseas and having to order
Exactly.
thousands, you have the ability to do smaller batches.
Exactly. Yes.
That's awesome. Now you've leveraged crowdfunding to help with funding and pre-orders. How do you know if a crowdfunding campaign is right for your business? And also, how do you make sure that it's successful? Because from what I know, if your crowdfunding campaign isn't a success, then you just don't get any funding.
Yes. So the strategy is pre selling, and it doesn't really matter if it's crowdfunding or if it's like on Kickstarter or Indiegogo or some other platform, or you could be pre selling on your own Shopify website.
Right.
So you can really decide. I teach everyone the strategy through Factory 45 of how to pre sell a product, but you can decide what the right avenue is for you. It's funny because we actually just did a roundtable with the mentors, with my alumni mentors, and half of them pre-sold on Kickstarter and half of them pre-sold through their e-commerce sites.
Hmm.
And there was not really like a clear reason why. It's funny, it came down to personality. Like it was like if you could handle the pressure of doing this big Kickstarter campaign and having to reach your goal and having a timeline and like making it this big launch event, those people chose crowdfunding and Kickstarter. Whereas if you wanted to do it a little bit more quietly and just kind of test the waters and still pre-sell, but do it without making it like this big thing, then you chose pre-selling on your own website.
Oh, interesting. Okay. So then, in terms of pre selling with the crowdfunding campaign,
Mhm.
were there any sort of key success factors that you would say, oh, you got to have this? Or,
It's mostly comes back to building an audience before you launch.
hmm,
Like you have to have that built-in audience. You have to have an email list. You have to have a social media following, and then creating sort of the pre-launch excitement, and then having that take you into the launch, which you want to get about a third of the way funded in the first week, a third to 50% funded in the first week. And then you're going to hit a really painful plateau where like it seems like nothing is happening and you're not getting any pre-orders. And then at the end, there will be that uptick that takes
hmm.
you past your goal. But it really comes down to having the built-in audience. That's the number one thing that's consistent across all successful campaigns I've seen.
Wow. Okay. Interesting. Yeah, I just interviewed somebody about this and she said it was mostly family and friends because all of these other people who are on it all seem to have this already proven product or something out there like ready to go and maybe that they'd had the audience for it and that's how they got it. So that's a very good tip. So and you also talked about pre-selling without the crowdfunding campaign, so more towards your own e-commerce site. Or are there any tips that you give there? Is it same like use your email list and build that audience as well?
Yeah, it's really the same strategy. I still tell people you want to have a set timeline. These are not pre-sales that go on forever. Like, you want 2 weeks to 30 days of pre-selling. You want to create that scarcity, that urgency, like maybe even having limited quantities available.
Mm,
But again, I would say even more so with pre-selling from your own e-commerce site, you have to have the audience even more because you can't even rely on like the random strangers just on Kickstarter, like looking for cool products to support.
right, exactly. Okay, that's great. And what are some must-have launch tactics for fashion brands? And maybe that we've already spoke about it. It's the pre-selling, getting pre-orders. Is there anything else that you'd say, oh, you gotta have this?
Great photography. You have to
Mm,
have great product photography. I think that's another thing where I'm all about like the prototype and the beta and just doing it and getting it out there and not like focusing on perfection. But if there's one thing I would invest in, it is good, like great product photography and diversifying what you have for photography so that you have, whole slew of photos for Instagram and social media. Then you have a bunch for your website. And then you have a bunch that will work for your Kickstarter campaign if you're doing it that way. Digital advertising if you do that. But I would say that's the thing that also truly sets apart very successful brands from the mediocre, not as great brands.
it's so true on e-commerce websites. Like you have to have great photography or else you can't really show off your brand in a way that you want to because it's not live.
And on that note of photography, other option is like the social proof photography. So if you have samples or if you do a small sample size run, to have partnerships with influencers. They can be micro influencers. They don't have to be the people with 100,000 followers. It could be
Right.
20,000 followers, but be able to trade a garment for a few photos and an Instagram story. And that's another really good way to kind of leverage photography. You can repost it on your site. And again, it builds that social proof.
That's a great point. Yeah, thank you for that. I wanted to touch on COVID because it's just, obviously it's a reality that we're all facing. And I've heard from many people that they've said that through COVID, they're not able to get answers from suppliers. It's put pressures on suppliers for products. So, what have been some of the challenges that the industry's faced during this time? And so, maybe also some of the bonus upside potential things as well.
I have not heard this as much. I think it could have to do with most of my entrepreneurs are working with localized supply chains. So they're not having to deal with as much like overseas shipping, although most fabric is still made overseas. And then there was like the whole shift of American factories. A lot of them shifted to PPE. So I think it has changed from the manufacturers and suppliers I've talked to. They all say like, yeah, we're making PPE now, but we're not going to abandon the fashion industry or the apparel manufacturing industry in the US because, hopefully COVID's not going to last forever. Like we're not going to be in this crisis forever and the fashion industry will come back and they don't want they don't want to solely rely on creating PPE when that's going to be not as needed, hopefully, eventually. In April, I wrote a article that was titled, it was something like why it's never been a better time to start a sustainable fashion brand. And it was because like this pandemic it was the beginning of the pandemic. And I really, truly felt that. And then I started to hear from the entrepreneurs that I had worked with who were already in business, like they had established brands. And March and April being their best months ever, and 2020 being set to be their highest revenue ever.
Oh.
So I think this came back to sort of what we were talking about before is there was a bit of this shift with the consumer of realizing the importance of shopping small and supporting your local businesses. And I think the smaller, independent, sustainable, and ethical fashion brands, especially the ones focused on e-commerce, have really benefited from that. If there's a silver lining to all of this.
It's nice to hear a silver lining because a lot of the news we have is bad. So I hate to say there's a bright side to the COVID, but
Mm-hmm.
let's try to look on some of the positives and remember that this could be shifting certain behaviors, which is a great thing.
I hope so.
And so, what are your top tips? I know we spoke about a few of them, but any other tips that if somebody wants to get into the fashion industry or sustainable fashion industry, what would you say?
Now more than ever, it's so important to build community. And that's probably just another word for audience, which I spoke to so much, but maybe this emphasizes how important it is. But I think sometimes we look at social media from a brand standpoint as I just need to market, I just need to sell, I just need to put my products out there. And ultimately, what people want right now is connection to the founder,
Mm.
connection to the employees if you have them. And so having that two-way conversation versus just a one-way, look at my stuff, look at my stuff, look at my stuff, connecting in the comments of your Instagram post, responding to DMs, really remembering that that is what is going to create a customer for life.
Oh, yeah, that's so true. Yeah, and I think community is a little bit different than just creating an audience because
Mhm.
it's a two-way, but it's also a multi-way partnership where you are connecting with that person, but you're also being the connector and connecting them with other people and supporting and so on. So that's super important, especially right now, for sure.
Yeah, and I would also say just as a separate tip is to remember not to be so married to your idea that you can't see better ideas along the way. I often run into that with my entrepreneurs in the beginning of the program. They're so committed to doing this thing this way and they won't stray from it at all. And then it becomes really, really hard. It becomes really hard to find fabric for that. It becomes really hard to find a manufacturer for that. And so instead of I encourage them, tweak this. This is the most sustainable way, but let's do it a little less so we can just get the product out there rather than being so married to this first idea that you can't even move forward and just get the product out there, get customer feedback, and then take it from there. And we can always aim to get a little bit more sustainable, a little bit better as the company grows and the product receives feedback and you're able to use that feedback.
That's a great point. I also echo that experience where people are married to an idea, but oftentimes your first idea is not the one you actually end up going with. So it's great to
Totally.
be flexible and listen to your consumers and or what other people, like what your audience wants, to be,
Yeah.
not so married to your own thing.
Yeah, and I have personal experience with that. Like back in 2010, when I was developing my first the clothing company, we had 10 pieces, 10 garments that could be worn 100 different ways. And we realized like, oh my gosh, the product development for this is going to be so expensive. This is so complicated. Whoa, we need to dial it back. And so what ended up happening is we brought that down to one signature piece that could be worn 30 different ways. So it was like the same concept, but we were able to pare down. So we didn't have to spend, 2 years in product development for 10 garments. We could just get in the product development of one garment, take it to market and see how the customer responded.
Right. That's a great illustration of what we just talked about. And that's very interesting. I have to check out that product. It's so cool. Is it still around?
I think it might be still around in some capacity. It's called the Versalette. But to be honest, once we launched, then there were all these knockoffs after. So you could definitely find the knockoff version if the Versalette isn't still out there.
Oh, funny. That sounds very cool. All right. Thank you. This has been amazing. Is there anything else that you'd like to add to our conversation? Any last words?
If people would like to find me, I'm at factory45.co. That's my website. Applications to the accelerator program don't open again until May 2021, but I have a bunch of resources, digital products on my website. And then you can find me on Instagram at factory45co.
Perfect. Thank you so much. This has been amazing. I've learned a lot about the sustainable fashion industry. It's awesome. And I think this will get everybody's wheels turning on what they can develop and just thinking about sustainable fashion and thinking also about the way they shop. So thank you so much. And we'll check out your podcast for sure. It sounds super interesting. Can you repeat the name?
Yes, it's the Clean Living Podcast.
Perfect. We'll also add that to the show notes. So thanks again, and we'll see you soon, Shannon.
Thank you, Nicole.
Thank you for listening to the Productpreneur Podcast. If you loved this episode, we'd be so grateful if you could take a sec to subscribe, share it, and review it on Apple Podcasts. Your review will help more women build their own dream product business. By the way, if you have any feedback, comments, or questions, email me at info@nicoledelarzac.com. Until next time, keep dreaming up those product ideas.